I pulled into the Magnolia Heights subdivision in Phoenix, Arizona at exactly 6:15 on a Tuesday evening. My shoulders still tight from a 14-hour workday that involved 3 witness interviews and enough paperwork to drown a horse. The gate stood before me like some kind of medieval fortress entrance, which seemed ridiculous considering this was just a residential community where people barbecued on weekends and complained about their neighbor's lawn height. I'd bought the house here 6 months ago specifically because it was close to the FBI field office where I worked, and the commute meant I could actually get home before midnight on most days. The gate had always been open during my previous visits, but tonight 2 men in ill-fitting security uniforms stood blocking the entrance with the kind of authority that suggested they'd just been handed shiny new badges and were dying to use them. I rolled down my window as the taller one approached, a guy in his mid-50s with a gut hanging over his belt and a mustache that looked like it belonged in a 70s cop show. His partner hung back, younger, maybe late 20s, with the nervous energy of someone who wasn't quite sure what he was supposed to be doing, but was committed to looking important while doing it. "Good evening, sir," the older guard said, his tone carrying that particular blend of politeness and suspicion that security guards everywhere seem to master. "I'm going to need to see some identification before I can let you through." I blinked at him, genuinely confused. "I live here." "House on Sycamore Drive, been here 6 months. New policy, sir. All residents must show ID when entering the community. HOA board implemented it yesterday." He crossed his arms, and I noticed the patch on his shoulder read Sentinel Security Services in gold lettering that was already starting to peel. The day had been long enough without this nonsense. I'd spent the morning interviewing a witness in a fraud case who couldn't remember what year it was, let alone details about financial transactions. Then the afternoon sorting through evidence that may or may not connect to a larger investigation my team was running. My patience had worn thin somewhere around hour 10, and I had exactly 0 interest in playing games with rent-a-cops who probably couldn't tell a real security threat from a Girl Scout selling cookies. "I've never had to show ID before," I said, keeping my voice level. "And I didn't receive any notice about a policy change." "Well, that's not my problem, sir. No ID, no entry. Those are my orders." The guard's hand moved to rest on his belt, near where a canister of pepper spray hung next to a flashlight that probably weighed more than my service weapon. The younger guard had moved closer now, positioning himself at an angle that was probably supposed to look tactical but mostly just looked awkward. "Is there a problem here, Marcus?" "No problem, Tommy. Just explaining the new rules to this gentleman." Marcus turned back to me, his expression hardening. "So, are you going to show me your ID, or are we going to have an issue?" I could have shown them my driver's license. Should have, probably, just to avoid the drama, but something about the whole situation rubbed me the wrong way. The aggressive posturing, the sudden policy change with no notice, the implication that I was somehow suspicious for wanting to enter the community, where I paid a mortgage and HOA fees that were frankly insulting given the lack of amenities they provided. Plus, I'd had a really long day, and sometimes when you've spent hours dealing with actual criminals, you have a limited tolerance for petty authority trips. I reached for my wallet, watching both guards tense slightly, their hands moving instinctively toward their belts. What I pulled out wasn't my driver's license. The FBI badge caught the Arizona sunset, the gold shield gleaming as I held it up along with my credentials. "Special Agent Nathan Keller, Federal Bureau of Investigation," I said calmly. "Now, I'm going to drive through this gate, go to my house, and have the bourbon I've been thinking about for the last 3 hours. We clear. The transformation was immediate and spectacular. Marcus's face went from ruddy and aggressive to pale and shocked in about 2 seconds flat. Tommy actually took a step backward, his eyes wide as he stared at my credentials like they might explode. The tough guy posturing evaporated like morning dew in the desert sun. Agent, I didn't. Marcus stammered, his hand dropping from his belt. We were just following orders, sir. The HOA president, she said we had to check everyone, no exceptions. The HOA president, I repeated flatly. Let me guess. Middle-aged woman, probably named something like Karen or Susan, acts like she's running the Pentagon instead of a suburban neighborhood. Patricia, Tommy volunteered, his voice cracking slightly. Patricia Hallbrook. She's the one who hired us yesterday, said the community needed better security, said we had to be strict about checking IDs. Of course. I'd heard about Patricia Hallbrook in passing from my neighbor, an elderly man named George who spent most of his days walking his ancient beagle and complaining about HOA overreach. According to George, Patricia had been elected HOA president 3 months ago and had immediately started treating the position like she'd been appointed empress of a small nation. New rules about trash can placement, regulations about what color you could paint your mailbox, threats of fines for lawns that exceeded 3 inches in height. The usual HOA horror stories, except Patricia apparently approached it all with the zeal of a religious convert. Right, I said, tucking my badge back into my pocket. Well, Marcus, Tommy, here's how this is going to work. You're going to open this gate, I'm going to drive through, and tomorrow I'm going to have a conversation with Patricia about harassment and unlawful detention. Because unless you've got probable cause to believe I'm committing a crime, you have zero legal authority to demand identification from me. None. You're private security, not law enforcement, and this little power trip you've got going violates about 6 laws I can think of off the top of my head. We didn't mean any harm, Agent Keller, Marcus said quickly, already moving toward the gate controls. We were just doing what we were told, following orders. Right. That excuse has a pretty terrible track record historically. I watched as the gates swung open with a mechanical whir. And just so we're clear, if I hear about you two harassing any other residents with this ID demand nonsense, I'll be making some calls to your employer and possibly to the Arizona Department of Public Safety about unauthorized security operations. I drove through without waiting for a response, my rearview mirror showing me 2 very nervous security guards having what looked like an intense conversation. The streets of Magnolia Heights were quiet in that artificial way planned communities always are, with perfectly spaced palm trees and streetlights that all matched and houses that adhered to exactly 4 approved color schemes. My place was a 3-bedroom ranch style near the back of the development, backing up to a stretch of desert that the HOA maintained as natural open space, which meant they didn't water it but would fine you if you tried to use it. I parked in my garage and sat there for a moment, letting the engine tick as it cooled, trying to decide if I was more angry or just exhausted. The anger won. I'd dealt with enough actual problems today, actual crimes with actual victims, that the idea of some power-hungry HOA president creating her own little police state made my blood pressure spike. I'd moved to Magnolia Heights for convenience and quiet, not to be harassed at my own gate by security guards with delusions of adequacy. My phone rang as I was heading inside. The caller ID showed my partner, Derek Chen, probably calling to discuss tomorrow's witness interview schedule. Keller, I answered, juggling the phone and my keys as I unlocked the door. You sound thrilled to hear from me, Derek said dryly. Bad day, long day. What's up? Just confirming we're starting at 8 tomorrow with the Johnson interview. Also wanted to give you a heads up that Morrison wants a full briefing on the fraud case by Friday. I groaned, dropping my keys on the counter and heading straight for the cabinet where I kept the good bourbon. Of course he does, because I don't have enough paperwork already. Hey, at least you get to go home to your nice quiet suburb. I'm still stuck in my apartment with the neighbor who thinks 3 a.m. is the perfect time for saxophone practice. Yeah, about that quiet suburb, I said, pouring 2 fingers of Maker's Mark into a glass. Just got stopped at my own gate by HOA hired security demanding ID. There was a pause. You're kidding. Nope. 2 rent-a-cops full authority trip wouldn't let me through until I flashed my badge. Derek laughed, the sound tinny through the phone speaker. Oh man, how'd that go over? About like you'd expect. They looked like they were going to need clean pants. I took a sip of the bourbon, feeling the burn settle pleasantly. Apparently, the HOA president decided the community needed better security. Without, informing any of the residents or checking if it was legal to detain people at the gate. You going to do something about it? Oh yeah, tomorrow after work I'm having a conversation with this Patricia Holbrook. Should be fun. Please tell me you're going to record it. I'll take notes. It's going to be educational for her. We talked for a few more minutes about work logistics before hanging up. I finished my bourbon while scrolling through emails on my phone, finding absolutely nothing from the HOA about new security measures or ID requirements. Not an email, not a letter, nothing. Which meant Patricia had just unilaterally decided to implement a policy without bothering with the tedious step of actually informing the people it affected. Sleep came eventually, though I spent a good hour staring at the ceiling thinking about the conversation I was going to have with the HOA president. I'd dealt with terrorists, organized crime figures, and corrupt politicians in my career with the Bureau. One overzealous HOA president should be a cakewalk. Still, there was something particularly irritating about petty tyranny. At least actual criminals knew they were breaking the law and had the decency to try to hide it. HOA dictators seemed to genuinely believe they were doing everyone a favor while trampling over basic rights. Wednesday morning came too early, announced by my alarm at 5:30, and the Arizona sun already promising another scorcher. I went through my routine on autopilot. Shower, shave, suit and tie, service weapon secured in its holster, credentials in my pocket. The drive to the field office was blessedly free of gate guards, and I arrived at my desk by 7 with coffee strong enough to strip paint, and a determination to get through the day so I could deal with the HOA situation. The Johnson interview went better than expected. Our witness, a bookkeeper who'd noticed irregular transactions at her company, had documentation that could blow the case wide open. Derek and I spent 3 hours going through spreadsheets and bank records, building a timeline that showed a pattern of embezzlement going back at least 5 years. By lunch, we had enough to bring charges, and by mid-afternoon we'd coordinated with the prosecutor's office to start preparing the case. Good work today, Derek said as we packed up around 5. Morrison's going to be happy with the progress. Yeah, well, Morrison can show his happiness by not burying us in paperwork, I replied, shrugging into my jacket. I've got to head out. Got an appointment with an HOA president who needs an education in civil rights. Good luck. Don't arrest her unless you absolutely have to. No promises. The drive back to Magnolia Heights had me rehearsing conversations in my head, trying to decide on the right approach. Professional but firm seemed like the way to go. I wasn't there to abuse my authority as a federal agent, but I also wasn't going to tolerate illegal detention policies in the community where I lived. The gate was unmanned when I arrived, which was interesting. Either the guards were on a different shift, or word had gotten back to Patricia about yesterday's encounter, and she'd pulled them. I drove straight to the HOA office, a small building near the community center that was open until 7 on weekdays for residents who needed to pay fees or file complaints. The parking lot held 3 cars, and through the window, I could see someone moving around inside. I took a moment to center myself, leaving my badge in my pocket. This was a conversation between a resident and his HOA, not an FBI investigation. Yet, the office was aggressively beige inside, with motivational posters about community spirit sharing wall space with notices about upcoming violations hearings. A young woman at the front desk looked up as I entered, her professional smile already in place. "Good evening. How can I help you?" "I need to speak with Patricia Holbrook. Is she available?" "May I ask what this is regarding?" "The new security policy at the gate. I'm a resident, Nathan Keller, and I wasn't notified about any changes." The receptionist's smile dimmed slightly. "Let me check if she's available." "One moment, please." She disappeared through a door behind her desk, and I heard muffled voices. Less than a minute later, she reappeared with a woman in her early 50s who radiated the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're always right. Patricia Holbrook was exactly what I'd pictured. Blonde hair styled in that particular suburban mom way that probably required weekly salon visits, designer athleisure where that had never seen actual exercise, and an expression that suggested she was already annoyed at having to deal with me. "Mr. Keller," she said, not offering a handshake. "Melissa said you had questions about our new security measures. That's one way to put it. Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" She hesitated, clearly not thrilled about the idea, but finally nodded toward a small conference room off the main office. "We can speak in there, though I should mention I only have about 15 minutes before another appointment. This won't take long." The conference room had the same beige enthusiasm as the rest of the office, with a table that seated 6 and more posters about community guidelines. Patricia sat across from me, her posture perfect, hands folded on the table in a way that made me think she'd practiced the gesture. "Now, what seems to be the problem?" she asked, her tone suggesting that any problem was undoubtedly of my own making. "Yesterday evening, I was stopped at the community gate by 2 security guards who demanded identification before allowing me to enter. I was not notified of any policy change, and I've checked my email and mail. Nothing from the HOA about this new requirement." Patricia's expression didn't change. "The board approved enhanced security measures at our meeting on Monday. We felt it was necessary to ensure the safety and security of all residents. By detaining them at the gate and demanding papers." "Patricia, you do understand that's not legal, right?" Her eyes narrowed. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "The HOA has every right to implement security measures we deem necessary for the community." "Actually, you don't. Not like this." I kept my voice level, professional. "Private security guards have no legal authority to demand identification from residents. They're not law enforcement. They can't detain people. What you've implemented is essentially a checkpoint in a private community, and unless you've got specific legal authorization, which I'm betting you don't, you're opening the HOA up to massive liability." "I've consulted with our attorney," Patricia said stiffly. "These measures are perfectly legal." "Then your attorney is either incompetent or you misunderstood what they told you, because I'm a lawyer, among other things, and I can tell you exactly how many laws this policy violates." I leaned forward slightly. false imprisonment, unlawful detention, violation of freedom of movement. And that's just for starters. If those guards physically prevented anyone from entering, you're looking at potential assault charges. That's ridiculous. We're trying to protect the community. From what exactly? What specific threat prompted this sudden need for ID checks? Have we had a string of break-ins, criminal activity? Or did you just decide that it would be nice to control who comes and goes? Patricia's face was flushing now, spots of color appearing on her cheeks. I don't appreciate your tone, Mr. Keller. The board made a decision that we felt was in the best interest of all residents. Did the board vote on this? Because I'd love to see the meeting minutes. I'd also love to see where in the HOA bylaws it states that you have the authority to implement checkpoints and ID requirements. The board has broad authority to ensure community safety and security. Broad authority doesn't mean unlimited authority. And it definitely doesn't mean you can violate residents' civil rights. I pulled out my phone, opening the camera app. I'm going to need copies of the board meeting minutes where this was approved, the legal opinion from your attorney stating this policy is legal, and documentation of how residents were notified. I'll wait. Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't have to provide you with anything. If you have concerns, you can file them in writing and they'll be addressed at the next board meeting. That's not how this works. You've implemented a policy that affects me directly, that potentially violates my rights, and you're refusing to provide documentation. Yeah, that's not going to fly. I stood as well, keeping my expression neutral. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to shut down this security checkpoint immediately. You're going to inform those guards that they have no authority to demand ID from anyone, and you're going to send out a notice to all residents explaining that the policy has been rescinded. And if I don't? Patricia's voice had gone cold, her eyes hard. Are you threatening me, Mr. Keller? Not threatening. Informing. Because if this continues, I'll be filing a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, who oversees HOA operations. I'll also be consulting with an attorney about a lawsuit for violations of civil rights. And depending on what else I find in your board minutes and financial records, there might be other agencies interested in how you're running this HOA. You can't just demand to see our records. Actually, as a homeowner and HOA member, I have a right to access financial records, meeting minutes, and other HOA documents. That's Arizona law. So yes, I can demand to see your records, and you're required to provide them within a specific time frame. I headed toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Patricia. Yesterday evening when your security guards detained me, I identified myself as a federal agent. Special Agent Nathan Keller, FBI. Those guards can confirm. Now, I wasn't there in an official capacity, but I'm very curious about what other policies you might have implemented that could attract federal attention. So I'm going to go through those records very carefully. Her face had gone from flushed to pale. You're FBI? Yeah. And before you ask, no, I'm not investigating the HOA. But I am a resident who's been harassed and illegally detained by security guards you hired. So I'm going to make sure this situation gets resolved, one way or another. I opened the door. You've got until Friday to shut down the checkpoint and provide me with those documents. After that, I start making phone calls to people who are going to be very interested in how you're running things here. I left without waiting for a response, my heart rate elevated but my mind clear. That had gone about as well as expected, which was to say Patricia was probably already on the phone with someone, either her attorney or another board member, trying to figure out how much trouble she was in. The answer was potentially quite a lot, depending on what else I found in the HOA records. The drive home took 2 minutes, barely enough time to process the conversation. I'd been professional, hadn't raised my voice, hadn't threatened anything I couldn't back up. But I'd also made it very clear that I wasn't going to roll over for whatever power trip she was on. My phone rang as I was pulling into my garage, the number showing as unknown. "Keller," I answered. "Agent Keller, this is Marcus from Gate Security yesterday evening." The guard's voice was anxious, words coming fast. "I just got a call from my supervisor at Sentinel Security. He said we're being pulled from the Magnolia Heights contract, effective immediately. Said there was some kind of complaint filed and the HOA is terminating our services." I felt a grim satisfaction. That was fast. Patricia must have called your company right after I left her office. "Agent Keller, I want to apologize again for yesterday. I was just following the instructions we were given. I didn't mean to overstep or cause any problems. Marcus, let me give you some advice. Next time a client asks you to do something like demand ID from people, check with your supervisor first. Make sure it's legal. Because what you were doing yesterday could have gotten you and your partner arrested for false imprisonment if someone wanted to push it." I didn't realize. The HOA president said it was all legal, that we had the authority. And that's why you verify. Patricia Holbrook isn't a lawyer, and even if she consulted with one, that doesn't mean she told you the whole truth about what you're allowed to do. I paused, considering. "Are you and Tommy okay?" "Still employed?" "Yeah, our supervisor said we're not in trouble, that it was a client issue, not a performance issue. We're getting reassigned to a different site." "Good. Look, I'm not trying to ruin anyone's life here, but that checkpoint was illegal and it needed to stop. You two just got caught in the middle of an HOA president's power trip. I get it. And thank you, Agent Keller, for not, making it worse for us." We hung up, and I sat in my car for a moment, processing. Patricia had moved fast, probably trying to eliminate evidence and cut ties with the security company before I could follow through on any threats, which suggested she knew damn well the policy was questionable at best. Interesting. I'd definitely be requesting those records, seeing what else she might be trying to hide. Thursday morning brought a surprise in the form of an email from Patricia Holbrook, time stamped at 6:14 a.m. "Mr. Keller, after further review and consultation with our legal counsel, the Magnolia Heights HOA Board has decided to discontinue the security checkpoint program at the community gate. This decision was made in the interest of resident convenience and to address concerns that were raised about the implementation. The gate will return to normal operation effective immediately. We apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused. Sincerely, Patricia Holbrook, HOA President." No admission of wrongdoing, no acknowledgement that the policy was illegal, just a bland corporate apology that meant absolutely nothing. I forwarded the email to Derek with a note. "HOA caved, still requesting records though." His response came back in less than a minute. "You're going to make enemies in your neighborhood. Already did." Work consumed most of Thursday with the fraud case paperwork, and a surprise development in another investigation that required 3 hours of database searches and coordination with the Phoenix Police Department. By the time I got home at 8 p.m., I was too exhausted to think about HOA drama. Friday, I was requesting those records and seeing exactly what Patricia Holbrook was so worried about protecting. Friday morning started with coffee and a formal written request for HOA records, citing the specific Arizona statutes that gave me the right to access meeting minutes, financial records, and correspondence related to the security policy. I sent it via email with a read receipt and followed up with a printed copy delivered to the HOA office before I went to work. The receptionist who accepted the envelope looked nervous, like I was handing her a bomb instead of a legal document request. The day at the office flew by with the usual chaos of an active investigation. By the time I left at 6, I'd almost forgotten about the HOA situation until I pulled into Magnolia Heights and saw George walking his ancient beagle near the mailboxes. "Nathan," he called out, waving enthusiastically. "Did you hear about the security checkpoint fiasco?" I rolled down my window. "Heard about it, I caused it." George's face lit up with unholy glee. "That was you. Oh man, the neighborhood email chain has been going crazy." Patricia sent out a message saying the checkpoint was discontinued due to logistical concerns. But someone said they saw you going into the HOA office on Wednesday looking seriously pissed off. I had a conversation with Patricia about legal liability and civil rights violations. She seemed to think the HOA board had unlimited authority. Of course she did. Patricia thinks the HOA presidency makes her queen of the subdivision. George shook his head. "You know she tried to fine me last month because my trash cans were visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. That's not even unusual. Everyone's cans are out for a while after pickup." Exactly what I told her. But she's got this mission to enforce every tiny rule to the letter, or make up new rules when the existing ones don't give her enough power. I filed that information away. "George, have you noticed anything else strange? Other new policies or sudden rule changes?" He thought for a moment, the beagle sniffing around his feet with the slow determination of a very old dog. "Now that you mention it, there was that thing with the Johnsons 3 doors down from you. Patricia tried to fine them for having a vegetable garden in their backyard, said it violated the landscaping guidelines. Except the guidelines don't say anything about vegetable gardens, and besides, it's their backyard, not even visible from the street. Did they fight it? They paid the fine. $200. Figured it was easier than arguing." George's expression darkened. "And the Martinses got hit with a violation notice about their roof tiles being the wrong shade after they had to replace some that were damaged in that storm we had in March. The tiles they replaced matched exactly, but Patricia said they needed to redo the whole roof to ensure color consistency. That sounds expensive and completely unreasonable." "It is." "They're fighting it, but Patricia scheduled a violations hearing where the board is going to vote on whether to pursue legal action to force compliance." The more George talked, the clearer the pattern became. Patricia wasn't just overzealous. She was using her position to harass residents with frivolous violations and unreasonable demands. Which raised the question of why. Was it just a power trip, or was there something else going on? "George, do you know who else is on the HOA board?" "There's Patricia, obviously. Then Robert Simmons, he's the treasurer, owns a landscaping company. Linda Hayes, the secretary, she's a real estate agent. And Douglas Park, general board member, works in finance downtown. Any of them pushing back on Patricia's enforcement crusade?" "Not that I've heard. Linda seems to go along with whatever Patricia wants. Robert and Douglas are harder to read, but they haven't objected to anything publicly." I thanked George and headed home, my mind working through possibilities. An HOA board that was rubber-stamping questionable enforcement actions. A president who thought she had unlimited authority, and residents being hit with fines for minor or invented violations. It could be simple tyranny, someone drunk on a little bit of power. But it could also be something more systematic, especially if there was money involved. The weekend passed quietly, giving me time to catch up on actual rest and think through my approach to the HOA situation. Monday morning brought a response to my records request, delivered via email from someone named Jennifer Young, who identified herself as the HOA's attorney. Mr. Keller, we are in receipt of your request for HOA records dated November 1, 2025. Please be advised that while homeowners do have rights to access certain HOA documents under Arizona law, your request is overly broad and does not comply with the procedural requirements. Specifically, you have not provided adequate notice of the purpose of your request, nor have you limited your request to relevant and specific documents. Additionally, some of the materials you have requested may be protected by attorney-client privilege or may contain confidential information regarding other homeowners. We are willing to work with you to provide appropriate access to records you are entitled to review. However, you will need to submit a revised request that complies with statutory requirements and HOA policies. Please contact our office to discuss the proper procedure for records requests. Sincerely, Jennifer Young, Esq., HOA Legal Counsel. I read the email twice, then smiled. Jennifer Young had just made a significant tactical error. She'd acknowledged that I had rights to access records while simultaneously throwing up procedural roadblocks designed to discourage me from pursuing the request. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 6 years as a prosecutor before joining the FBI, and I knew exactly how to draft a document request that would survive any challenge. I spent my lunch break that day crafting a revised request that cited specific Arizona statutes, narrowed the scope to exactly what I needed, and included a detailed explanation of purpose that focused on my rights as a homeowner to understand how the HOA was being managed. I requested meeting minutes from the past 12 months, financial statements for the same period, documentation related to the security checkpoint policy, including any legal opinions provided by Young's firm, and a list of all violation fines assessed in the past 6 months along with the basis for each fine. I sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested, copying both the HOA office and Jennifer Young. Derek found the whole thing hilarious when I told him about it over lunch on Tuesday. "You're going to spend more time fighting your HOA than working actual cases," he said, grinning over his sandwich. "It's the principle of the thing. If I let Patricia get away with this, she'll just keep pushing. And from what I'm hearing from neighbors, she's been harassing people for months." What do you think is really going on? Just a power-hungry HOA president or something more? I don't know yet. But the pattern of violations and fines is suspicious. If she's targeting specific residents or if there's a financial motive, that could be actual fraud. And if it is fraud, then it stops being an HOA dispute and becomes a criminal matter, which would be unfortunate for Patricia. The certified mail receipt came back on Thursday, confirming delivery. Arizona law gave the HOA 10 business days to respond to a proper records request. I marked the deadline on my calendar and went back to work, focusing on the fraud case that was finally moving toward indictment. 12 days later, I received a box via FedEx containing copies of HOA documents. The meeting minutes were heavily redacted in several places, with notes stating attorney-client privileged communication blacked out. The financial statements showed routine expenses for landscaping, pool maintenance, and general upkeep. But the list of violation fines was interesting. Over the past 6 months, Patricia's HOA board had assessed 43 fines against various homeowners, totaling over $12,000. That was almost triple the number of fines from the previous year, based on the comparison data George had mentioned from his own research. I spread the documents across my dining room table, looking for patterns. The fines ranged from $50 for minor violations like trash cans visible too long to $500 for more serious issues like unapproved exterior paint colors or landscaping changes. Several homeowners had been fined multiple times. The Johnsons, who George had mentioned, had been hit with 3 separate violations. The Martinses had 4. And there were others, residents I didn't know, with repeated fines for various infractions. What made it truly suspicious was the timing. Most of the enforcement actions had started ramping up about 4 months ago, right after Patricia became HOA president. Before that, the violation rate was much lower, averaging maybe 5 or 6 fines per year for genuinely serious issues. Patricia had turned it into a cottage industry. I pulled up the financial statements again, looking more carefully at the revenue side. HOA fees were standard, monthly assessments that went toward maintenance and operating costs. But there was a line item labeled Violation Enforcement Revenue that showed $12,300 collected in the past 6 months. Another line item, Legal and Enforcement Expenses, showed $8,400 paid out to a company called Compliance Solutions, LLC. I'd never heard of Compliance Solutions, LLC. A quick internet search turned up nothing. No website, no business listing, no reviews. That was odd. Most legitimate business-to-business companies had at least some online presence, even if it was just a LinkedIn page or a basic website. I made a note to dig deeper. The rest of the weekend went to analyzing the documents and cross-referencing information. By Monday morning, I had a working theory. Patricia had ramped up enforcement actions significantly, collecting fines that went into the HOA General Fund. But she was also paying a suspicious company called Compliance Solutions for unspecified services related to enforcement. If Compliance Solutions was somehow connected to Patricia or another board member, that could be self-dealing, which was illegal in the context of HOA management. I needed more information. Public records would tell me who owned Compliance Solutions, LLC. Arizona's Corporation Commission maintained a database of all registered businesses in the state, including ownership information. I could access that from work during my lunch break. The search took less than 5 minutes. Compliance Solutions LLC was registered in Arizona with a business address in Scottsdale. The registered agent and owner was listed as Robert Simmons. Robert Simmons, the HOA treasurer who owned a landscaping company. The same Robert Simmons who was on the board that was rubber-stamping Patricia's aggressive enforcement campaign. The same board that was paying his company $8,000 for Compliance Solutions while collecting $12,000 in violation fines. That was fraud. Clear, obvious fraud. The HOA was paying a board member's company for services, while that same board member was voting on enforcement actions that generated the revenue to pay his company. It was a textbook conflict of interest, and almost certainly a violation of Arizona's HOA regulations, if not outright criminal fraud. I sat at my desk, staring at the computer screen, thinking through my options. I could report this to the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which regulated HOAs and could investigate and impose penalties. I could file a lawsuit as a homeowner, potentially getting other residents to join in a class action. Or I could treat it as a potential criminal matter and refer it to the appropriate law enforcement agency. The problem with the criminal route was that HOA fraud cases were usually handled at the state level, unless there was evidence of broader criminal activity. The FBI didn't typically investigate homeowner association disputes unless they involved federal crimes like mail fraud, wire fraud, or corruption that crossed state lines. This seemed like a localized issue, relatively small in scale despite being illegal as hell. But before I made any moves, I wanted to be absolutely certain. I needed to confirm that Compliance Solutions hadn't actually provided any legitimate services, that the payments were basically kickbacks or self-dealing. That meant talking to residents who'd been fined and seeing if anyone from Compliance Solutions had ever contacted them or done anything that could justify $8,000 in fees. George was my first call when I got home that evening. George, it's Nathan Keller. I've got some questions about your interactions with the HOA regarding violations. Sure, shoot. Though I warn you, it'll just make you angry. When Patricia tried to fine you for the trash can thing, did anyone else contact you? Maybe someone from a company called Compliance Solutions. Compliance Solutions. Never heard of it. The only person I dealt with was Patricia directly. She sent me a violation notice via email, followed up with a certified letter demanding payment, and when I argued with her about it, she threatened to schedule a violations hearing. Did you ever see anyone inspecting properties or documenting violations? Anyone who might have been working for an enforcement company? Nope. Patricia drives around the neighborhood herself, taking pictures with her phone. I've seen her doing it. She'll cruise by houses looking for violations like she's on some kind of patrol. And you never paid the fine? Hell no. I sent her a response citing the exact language in the CC and Articus about trash cans and told her to pound sand. She backed off after that, probably figured I was more trouble than I was worth. Smart. Hey, do you have contact information for the Johnsons and the Martineses? I'd like to talk to them. You're building a case, aren't you? George's voice carried a note of satisfaction. About time someone took Patricia down a peg. Just gathering information. But yeah, if what I'm finding is what I think it is, Patricia and at least one other board member are going to have some serious problems. George gave me phone numbers and email addresses for several residents who'd been hit with violations. I spent the next 2 hours making calls and sending emails, introducing myself as a concerned homeowner and fellow victim of overly aggressive HOA enforcement. The responses were consistent. No one had ever been contacted by anyone from Compliance Solutions. The enforcement was all Patricia, sometimes with Linda Hayes copying emails in her capacity as board secretary. The fines were pure harassment for minor or invented violations, and several residents had paid just to make the problem go away. By Wednesday evening, I had statements from 8 different homeowners confirming the pattern. Patricia would identify a violation, often something trivial or not actually prohibited by the HOA rules. She'd send a notice demanding immediate correction and imposing a fine. If the homeowner pushed back, she'd threaten a violations hearing where the board would vote on additional penalties or legal action. Most people paid because fighting it seemed like more trouble than it was worth, and the amounts were usually small enough that hiring a lawyer would cost more than just paying the fine. The clincher came from Sandra Martinez, who'd been hit with the ridiculous roof tile violation. "We fought it," Sandra told me over the phone, her voice tight with frustration. "We went to the violations hearing with photos showing that the new tiles matched the old ones exactly. Patricia kept insisting they were different shades, that the whole roof needed to be replaced. It was insane." What happened at the hearing? The board voted against us, 3-1. Patricia, Linda, and Robert all voted to uphold the violation and the $500 fine. Douglas was the only one who voted in our favor. Did Robert Simmons say anything during the hearing? Any indication why he was supporting such an obviously bogus violation? He mostly just nodded along with whatever Patricia said. He did mention something about maintaining property values and ensuring compliance standards, which sounded like corporate buzzword nonsense. You ended up paying. We didn't have a choice. They were threatening to file a lien against our property if we didn't pay within 30 days. We couldn't risk that. That was the final piece. Robert Simmons was actively participating in enforcement decisions while his company was being paid from the fines collected. It wasn't just a conflict of interest, it was active fraud. He was voting to uphold bogus violations that generated revenue that was then used to pay his company for services that didn't exist. I had enough for a referral to law enforcement. The question was who would take it seriously. The Phoenix Police Department had a white-collar crime unit that handled fraud cases, but HOA disputes might not be high on their priority list. The Arizona Attorney General's office had a division that dealt with consumer fraud and could investigate HOA violations. That seemed like the better route. Thursday morning, I drafted a detailed complaint to the Arizona Attorney General's office, outlining the evidence of self-dealing and fraudulent enforcement. I included copies of the financial records showing payments to Compliance Solutions, the business registration showing Robert Simmons as owner, the violation notices and fines, and statements from homeowners confirming that no services had been provided by Compliance Solutions. I submitted it through their online portal and followed up with a phone call to make sure it had been received. The attorney handling consumer fraud cases was a woman named Jennifer Santos, who listened carefully as I summarized the situation. "This is pretty clearly fraudulent," she said after I finished. "Self-dealing by a board member, fictitious services being paid for from HOA funds. We'll need to investigate, get subpoenas for bank records to trace where the money actually went. How long does that usually take?" "Depends on how cooperative the parties are. If they fight the subpoenas, it could drag out. But given what you've described, I'd say we're looking at 2 to 3 months for a full investigation, then referral for prosecution if the evidence supports it. What should I do in the meantime?" "I'm a resident of this HOA, and Patricia Hallbrook is still in charge making decisions. Document everything. If you receive any violation notices or communications from the HOA, keep copies. Encourage other homeowners to do the same. And if there's going to be an HOA election or board meeting, you might want to attend and raise questions about the financial management. I'm guessing Patricia isn't going to be happy if she finds out I filed a complaint. Probably not. But you're within your rights as a homeowner and a citizen. If she retaliates, that's another issue we can address." I thanked her and hung up, feeling like I'd finally done something concrete to address the problem. But Jennifer Santos was right about one thing. Patricia was not going to be happy when she found out. And in a community the size of Magnolia Heights, word tended to travel fast. It traveled faster than I expected. Friday afternoon, I got home to find a notice taped to my front door. Violation notice. Property at 847 Sycamore Drive is in violation of CC&R Section 4.7 regarding front yard landscaping maintenance. Grass height exceeds approved maximum of 3 inches in multiple locations. Weeds visible in flower beds. Immediate correction required. Fine of $150 assessed. Payment due within 15 days. I looked at my front yard. The grass was maybe 3.5 inches tall, well within any reasonable interpretation of maintained landscaping. The weeds in the flower beds were exactly 2 tiny sprouts that I'd been planning to pull over the weekend. This was pure retaliation for my records request, and whatever Patricia had heard through the neighborhood grapevine about my investigation. I took photos of the yard from multiple angles. documenting the trivial nature of the alleged violations. Then I took the notice inside and scanned it, adding it to the file I was building. This was going to be exhibit A for retaliation when the Attorney General's office got around to investigating. The weekend brought more developments. George called Saturday morning. "Nathan, you need to check your email. Patricia sent out a neighborhood-wide message last night about a special HOA meeting." I pulled up my email and found the message. Special HOA Board Meeting. Monday, November 24, 2025, 7:00 p.m. Community Center. Agenda items include discussion of homeowner compliance issues, review of enforcement procedures, and consideration of bylaw amendments regarding member conduct and board authority. The timing wasn't coincidental. Patricia was circling the wagons, probably planning to push through changes that would make it harder for homeowners to challenge board decisions or access records. The reference to member conduct suggested she might try to implement rules about filing complaints or taking legal action against the HOA. "This should be interesting," I told George. "I'm definitely attending. Half the neighborhood is planning to show up. Word's gotten around about your investigation and people are angry. The Johnsons, the Martineses, the Chens from Oak Street, all the people who have been hit with bogus fines. Everyone wants answers." Monday evening came with the promise of drama. I arrived at the community center 15 minutes early and found the parking lot already half full. Inside, the main room was set up with rows of chairs facing a table at the front where the board would sit. At least 30 residents were already there, talking in small clusters with the energy of people who'd been pushed too far and were ready to push back. Patricia arrived precisely at 7, flanked by Linda Hayes and Robert Simmons. Douglas Park came in separately and took a seat at the board table with a neutral expression that suggested he knew this meeting was going to be contentious. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel. I hadn't known HOA presidents actually used outside of parody videos. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending this special meeting of the Magnolia Heights HOA Board. We have several important items to discuss tonight regarding community standards and governance." "Before you start," I said from my seat in the third row, "I'd like to know if this meeting was properly noticed per the HOA bylaws. Special meetings require minimum notice periods and specific agenda item descriptions." Patricia's jaw tightened. "Yes, Mr. Keller, the meeting was properly noticed. Notice was sent via email to all homeowners 48 hours in advance, which meets the bylaw requirements. And the agenda item about bylaw amendments regarding member conduct. Can you be more specific about what changes you're proposing?" "We'll be discussing that when we reach that portion of the agenda. I'd like to request that any proposed bylaw amendments be distributed in writing before they are voted on. Residents have a right to review and comment on changes to governing documents." Patricia's face was flushing, but she kept her voice level. "Noted. Now, if we can proceed with the meeting, the first agenda item is a review of enforcement procedures." Robert Simmons cleared his throat, shuffling papers in front of him. "As treasurer, I want to address some questions that have been raised about HOA financial management and enforcement activities. Over the past 6 months, we've implemented a more consistent approach to CC&R enforcement, which has resulted in increased compliance across the community." "Increased compliance or increased harassment?" Someone called from the back. I recognized the voice as George's. Robert's expression didn't change. "We've identified and corrected violations that were previously being ignored, which protects property values for all residents. By fining people for grass that's a half-inch too tall." That was Sandra Martinez, standing up in the front row. "You tried to fine us $500 because you claimed our roof tiles were the wrong shade, even though they matched exactly. That's not protecting property values, that's extortion. Mrs. Martinez, if you have a concern about a specific violation, you can file an appeal," Patricia interjected. "But this meeting is not the forum for relitigating individual cases." "Actually," I said, standing up, "this is exactly the forum. You called a special meeting to discuss enforcement procedures, and residents are telling you that those procedures are being abused." I pulled out my phone, opening the photo I'd taken of my own violation notice. Friday, I received a notice for grass being slightly over 3 inches and 2 tiny weeds in my flower bed. This came less than a week after I filed a detailed records request with the HOA, and after I had several conversations with neighbors about suspicious financial activities. That looks an awful lot like retaliation. The room erupted in conversation, multiple residents chiming in with their own stories of questionable violations. Patricia banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order. We will have order in this meeting." "Then answer the question," I said calmly. "Why have violation notices increased by over 700% since you became HOA president? And while you're at it, explain why the HOA is paying $8,000 to a company called Compliance Solutions LLC when no one in this community has ever seen anyone from that company do any work." Robert Simmons went pale. Patricia's mouth opened and closed without sound. Linda Hayes looked confused, like she hadn't known about any of this. Douglas Park leaned back in his chair with an expression of grim satisfaction. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Keller," Patricia finally said, "but the HOA's financial arrangements are proper and have been reviewed by our attorney." "Really?" "Because according to Arizona's Corporation Commission database, Compliance Solutions LLC is owned by Robert Simmons, who's sitting right there at the board table. The same Robert Simmons who's been voting to uphold violation fines that generate the revenue used to pay his company. That's called self-dealing, and it's illegal." The room went silent. Every eye turned to Robert, who looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Patricia had gone from flushed to ashen, her hands gripping the gavel like it was a lifeline. "There's been a misunderstanding," Robert stammered. "Compliance Solutions provides consulting services for enforcement protocols and violation documentation. Then, where are the work products? Where are the reports, the documentation, the protocols?" "Because I've talked to 8 different homeowners who have received violation notices, and not one of them has ever been contacted by your company. The only person doing enforcement is Patricia, driving around taking pictures with her phone. This is outrageous." Patricia slammed the gavel down. "You can't come into an HOA meeting and make baseless accusations against board members. They're not baseless. I've documented everything. The financial records showing payments to Compliance Solutions, the business registration showing Robert's ownership, the statements from homeowners confirming no services were provided. I've submitted all of it to the Arizona Attorney General's office, and they're opening an investigation into HOA fraud." The room erupted again, this time with residents shouting questions and demands. George was on his feet, asking about getting refunds for improper fines. Sandra Martinez was demanding Robert's resignation. Others were calling for the entire board to step down. Patricia kept banging the gavel, but no one was paying attention anymore. Douglas Park stood up, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I move that we adjourn this meeting immediately and schedule an emergency election for new board members. It's clear that there are serious questions about financial management that need to be addressed, and the current board has lost the confidence of the community. Second." At least 5 voices shouted simultaneously. "We can't just adjourn," Patricia protested. "We have agenda items to address." "Actually, we can," Douglas said firmly. "Any board member can move to adjourn, and if it's seconded and approved by majority vote, the meeting ends." "All in favor of adjourning," a chorus of "aye" filled the room. Patricia looked around wildly, but even Linda Hayes had her hand raised in support of adjournment. "Meeting adjourned," Douglas said, ignoring Patricia's attempt to continue. "Homeowners, please stay if you want to discuss next steps for addressing the board issues. Board members, I suggest you consult with your attorneys." The next hour was chaos in the best possible way. Residents formed an impromptu committee to review the HOA bylaws and determine the process for removing board members and calling for new elections. George volunteered to coordinate communication with the Attorney General's office. Sandra Martinez offered to collect documentation from everyone who'd been improperly fined, so we could request refunds from the HOA's general fund. Patricia and Robert left immediately, not speaking to anyone. Linda Hayes stayed, looking shell-shocked, claiming she hadn't known about the Compliance Solutions arrangement and had just been rubber stamping whatever Patricia brought to votes. Douglas Park confirmed that he'd been suspicious about the increased enforcement activity, but hadn't had access to detailed financial records to prove anything was wrong. "I voted against most of the violation decisions," Douglas told the group, "but I was always outvoted 3-1. Patricia, Linda, and Robert were a voting bloc, and I couldn't get anything done." "Why didn't you say something publicly?" someone asked. "I tried. I raised questions at board meetings, but Patricia shut me down, said I was being obstructive. And without proof of actual wrongdoing, I didn't want to make accusations I couldn't back up." I understood that. Whistleblowing was risky even when you had evidence. Without it, you just looked like a troublemaker. By 9:30, we'd formed a plan. The homeowner committee would draft a petition for a special election, which under the HOA bylaws required signatures from 25% of homeowners. Given the turnout tonight and the level of anger, that wouldn't be difficult. We'd also request a full forensic audit of HOA finances for the past year, looking not just at the Compliance Solutions payments, but at all expenditures to make sure there weren't other problems. I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic. The community was mobilized, the Attorney General was investigating, and Patricia's little empire was crumbling. But I knew from experience that cornered people do desperate things, and Patricia struck me as someone who wouldn't go down quietly. I was right. Wednesday morning, I received a certified letter from Jennifer Young, the HOA's attorney. "Mr. Keller, it has come to my attention that at the November 24, 2025 HOA meeting, you made defamatory statements about HOA board members, specifically accusing them of illegal activity without foundation. You also improperly disclosed confidential HOA financial information in a public forum, violating your duties as a homeowner and HOA member. The HOA board is considering legal action against you for defamation, breach of fiduciary duty, and tortious interference with HOA operations. You are hereby directed to cease making false statements about the HOA and its board members, to retract your accusations publicly, and to refrain from any further interference with HOA governance. Failure to comply may result in legal action, including but not limited to a lawsuit for damages, and a restraining order preventing you from attending HOA meetings or communicating with other homeowners about HOA business. You have until December 2, 2025 to provide written confirmation of your compliance with these directives. Sincerely, Jennifer Young, Esq. I read the letter twice, then laughed out loud. It was a textbook slap suit threat, strategic lawsuit against public participation. The goal wasn't to actually win a defamation case, which would be nearly impossible given that everything I'd said was true and documented. The goal was to intimidate me into shutting up and stopping the investigation. I forwarded the letter to Jennifer Santos at the Attorney General's office with a note. Patricia Holbrook is now threatening legal action to try to silence me. Thought you should be aware. Her response came within an hour. Thanks for the heads up. This is pretty clearly retaliatory and probably violates Arizona's anti-slap statute. Don't worry about it, and definitely don't retract anything. We'll include this in the investigation. I also sent a copy to every member of the homeowner committee with an explanation of what a slap suit was and why Patricia's threats were empty. George forwarded it to the entire neighborhood email list with a subject line reading, HOA board now threatening legal action to cover up fraud. That backfired on Patricia spectacularly. By Thursday evening, the petition for a special election had been signed by 68% of homeowners, more than double what was needed. The wave of anger had turned into a tsunami, and residents who'd been on the fence were now fully committed to cleaning house. Friday brought another development. The Phoenix Business Journal published a story about HOA fraud in Arizona suburbs, featuring Magnolia Heights as a case study. Somehow, a reporter had gotten wind of the Attorney General's investigation and had interviewed several residents about their experiences. The article quoted me extensively, using my background as an FBI agent to add credibility to the fraud allegations. It quoted George about the trash confine and Sandra Martinez about the roof tile issue. And it included a response from Jennifer Young claiming that all accusations were baseless and that the HOA was considering legal action against individuals making false statements. The article went viral in local news circles. By Monday, 3 TV stations had requested interviews with residents about HOA abuse. I declined media interviews, not wanting to jeopardize the investigation, but George and Sandra both appeared on evening news segments talking about their experiences. The publicity had an immediate effect. Tuesday morning, Robert Simmons submitted his resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately. The resignation letter, which was sent to all homeowners, contained no admission of wrongdoing but cited personal reasons and a desire to avoid continued controversy. Patricia released a statement accepting the resignation and announcing that the board would appoint a replacement member at the next regular meeting. Except there wasn't going to be a next regular meeting with Patricia in charge. Wednesday, the homeowner committee submitted the petition for a special election along with a motion to suspend the current board's authority pending the election results. Arizona HOA law allowed for such suspensions when there was evidence of financial mismanagement or breach of fiduciary duty. Thursday, Jennifer Young sent another letter, this time to the entire homeowner committee, threatening litigation if we proceeded with the special election. She claimed the petition was procedurally defective and that suspending the board's authority violated the HOA bylaws. It was more desperate posturing, and everyone knew it. Friday, December 6, the Attorney General's office executed search warrants on the HOA office, Patricia Holbrook's home, and Robert Simmons's business. I heard about it from George, who'd been walking his dog when he saw investigators carrying boxes out of the HOA office. The sight of state law enforcement agents treating the HOA like a crime scene sent a clear message to the entire community. This was serious, and there would be consequences. The investigation moved quickly after that. By mid-December, The Attorney General's office had traced the payments from the HOA to Compliance Solutions to personal accounts controlled by Robert Simmons. There was no evidence that any legitimate services had been provided. Bank records showed that Robert had made cash withdrawals shortly after receiving payments, suggesting he might have been kicking money back to someone else, though proving that would require more investigation. They also discovered that Patricia had been using HOA funds to pay Jennifer Young's law firm for personal legal services unrelated to HOA business, including drafting demand letters to residents who questioned her authority. That was another form of misappropriation, using community funds for personal benefit. On December 18, both Patricia Holbrook and Robert Simmons were arrested and charged with fraud, theft, and misappropriation of HOA funds. The charges carried potential prison sentences of up to 5 years. Linda Hayes was not charged, but was interviewed extensively as a witness. Douglas Park's cooperation with the investigation earned him immunity from prosecution and praise from investigators for trying to stop the corruption from within. The special election was held on January 10, 2026, with Douglas Park and 3 new board members elected by overwhelming margins. One of the new members was Sandra Martinez, who turned her anger about the roof tile incident into motivation to reform the HOA from within. Their first act was to vote to refund all improper fines assessed during Patricia's tenure, totaling over $12,000 distributed back to affected homeowners. Their second act was to hire a professional management company to handle day-to-day HOA operations, removing the opportunity for any future board to abuse their authority the way Patricia had. The management company would handle enforcement of legitimate violations using clear, published criteria, with an independent appeals process for homeowners who disagreed with violation notices. I got my $150 fine refunded in the form of a check that arrived with a personal note from Sandra. "Thanks for not backing down. You started something important." The criminal case against Patricia and Robert moved through the court system with the slow inevitability of justice. In March 2026, both pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation, substantial fines, and agreements to never serve on an HOA board again. Robert also agreed to dissolve Compliance Solutions LLC and repay the $8,000 his company had fraudulently received. Patricia was ordered to repay the legal fees she'd improperly charged to the HOA, totaling over $4,000. The whole saga ended with what George called a neighborhood reconciliation barbecue in late March, held at the community center with half the subdivision in attendance. Douglas Park, in his role as continued board member, gave a short speech about the importance of transparency and accountability in HOA governance. Sandra Martinez talked about turning negative experiences into positive change, and I was asked to say a few words, which I kept brief. 6 months ago, I got stopped at my own gate by security guards who thought they had authority they didn't have, implementing a policy that was illegal from the start. That confrontation led to discovering a pattern of abuse and fraud that had been hurting people in this community for months. The lesson isn't that all HOAs are corrupt or that all board members are criminals. The lesson is that unchecked authority, even at the level of a neighborhood association, can lead to serious problems. And the solution is residents staying informed, asking questions, and holding their leaders accountable. We did that here, and we fixed something that was broken. That's worth celebrating. The applause was genuine, and several people came up afterward to thank me for my role in exposing the corruption. George, predictably, was the most effusive. "You're a genuine neighborhood hero, Nathan," FBI agent takes down corrupt HOA president. It's like a movie. It's like a cautionary tale about power tripping board members, I corrected. And honestly, I just wanted to drive through my gate without being harassed. Everything else followed from that. Still, you could have just flashed your badge and moved on. Instead, you saw a pattern and did something about it. He was right, though I wouldn't have put it quite so dramatically, but the experience had been educational in its own way. In my work at the FBI, I dealt with sophisticated criminals running complex schemes. This had been petty crime at its pettiest. A small-time fraud that probably netted Patricia and Robert a few $1,000s at most, when you accounted for the kickback arrangement they'd clearly had going. But it had affected real people, families who'd paid bogus fines they couldn't afford, residents who'd been harassed and intimidated for minor or non-existent violations. The scale was different, but the principle was the same. People in positions of authority who abuse that authority need to be stopped, whether they're running international fraud schemes or just shaking down their neighbors for lawn violations. And sometimes it starts with something as simple as refusing to show your ID at a gate when you know you don't have to. Life in Magnolia Heights returned to normal, or at least a new normal where the HOA functioned the way it was supposed to. Maintaining common areas, organizing community events, enforcing legitimate rules fairly and transparently. The professional management company handled the day-to-day operations efficiently, and the new board focused on improving amenities rather than finding new ways to fine people. I settled back into my routine of long days at the office investigating actual federal crimes, coming home to a neighborhood that now felt genuinely welcoming rather than oppressive. The gate stood open most of the time, with security only present during community events when extra parking control was needed. No one demanded ID. No one harassed residents about minor landscaping issues. It was, in other words, what a homeowner association was supposed to be. The former HOA office became a small library and community room after the management company set up operations in a different location. Kids used it for homework after school. Book clubs met there on weekends, and someone organized a weekly coffee meetup for residents to socialize. The space that had been Patricia's domain, where she'd plotted enforcement campaigns and approved fraudulent payments, was transformed into something actually useful for the community. Derek found the whole aftermath hilarious when I updated him over beers one evening in April. So let me get this straight. You moved to a quiet suburb to avoid drama, ended up taking down a corrupt HOA board, became a neighborhood hero, and now everyone wants to elect you to the board. I declined, I said firmly. Serving on an HOA board sounds like a special kind of hell, even with good intentions. Fair enough, but you've got to admit, it's a better story than most people's HOA experiences. Most people's HOA experiences involve arguing about whether their porch furniture is an approved color. Mine involved fraud investigations, arrest warrants, and national news coverage. I would have preferred the furniture arguments. No, you wouldn't. You love this stuff. He was right, even though I wouldn't admit it out loud. There was something satisfying about seeing justice done, even in a relatively minor case like HOA fraud. Patricia and Robert had thought they could abuse their positions without consequences, that residents would just pay the fines and accept the harassment because fighting back was too much trouble. They'd been wrong, and the consequences, while not as severe as federal prison, had still been significant. Criminal records, financial penalties, public shame, and permanent bans from HOA leadership. For people whose identities had been wrapped up in their petty authority, those consequences probably felt devastating. I occasionally saw Patricia around the neighborhood in the months that followed. She'd aged visibly, the stress of prosecution and public disgrace taking a toll. She kept to herself, didn't make eye contact with neighbors, and seemed to be counting down the days until she could sell her house and move somewhere her name wasn't synonymous with HOA corruption. I didn't take any pleasure in her obvious misery, but I didn't feel bad about it either. She'd made choices, bad ones, and now she was living with the results. Robert Simmons I never saw again. His landscaping business folded after his arrest, clients unwilling to work with someone convicted of fraud. Last I heard, he'd moved to Tucson and was working in retail management, about as far from running his own company as he could get. The story had a lasting impact beyond Magnolia Heights. The media coverage prompted the Arizona legislature to pass new regulations on HOA governance, including mandatory transparency requirements for board finances, stricter conflict of interest rules, and easier processes for homeowners to challenge violations or remove board members. Several other HOAs in the Phoenix area conducted audits of their own finances after the publicity, discovering their own issues with mismanagement or questionable spending. I'd started something without meaning to, just by refusing to accept illegal detention at my own gate and following the evidence where it led. That first confrontation with Marcus and Tommy, the security guards who were just following orders from Patricia, had seemed like a minor annoyance at the time. But it had been the thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire scheme of corruption and abuse. Sometimes being an FBI agent means working complex investigations that take years to resolve. Sometimes it means analyzing financial records and building cases brick by brick against sophisticated criminals. And sometimes, apparently, it means taking down your HOA president and treasurer for defrauding your neighbors. The principles are the same. Follow the evidence, document everything, hold people accountable for breaking the law. As I sat on my back patio one warm evening in May, watching the sun set over the Arizona desert beyond the community boundaries, I reflected on how different things were from 6 months ago. The neighborhood was genuinely pleasant now, the kind of place I'd hoped it would be when I first moved in. Kids played in the streets without parents worrying about violation notices for chalk drawings. Residents planted gardens without fear of arbitrary fines. The community center hosted events that brought people together instead of meetings where Patricia threatened legal action. George walked by with his ancient beagle, waving as he passed. Sandra Martinez was in her driveway, washing her car while her kids ran through the sprinkler in the front yard. Douglas Park drove past, heading home from work, giving me a friendly honk. These were my neighbors, my community, and for the first time since moving in, it actually felt like a community rather than a subdivision under occupation by petty tyrants. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Still enjoying the quiet suburban life," I smiled, typing back. "It's quieter now. Though I'm never moving into another HOA if I can avoid it. Lesson learned, lesson learned. But if I do end up in an HOA again, at least I know how to handle corrupt board members. By going full FBI on them. By doing what's right and not backing down when someone abuses their authority." FBI badge optional but effective. The conversation drifted to work topics and weekend plans, but the sentiment stayed with me. I'd bought a house in Magnolia Heights for convenience, for the short commute and the quiet streets. I'd ended up fighting a battle I never expected, exposing corruption I'd stumbled into accidentally. But the fight had been worth it, not because I'd been personally vindicated, though that was satisfying, but because it had made life better for everyone in the community. That's what justice looks like at its most basic level. Not headlines or major prosecutions, though those have their place, but making things right when they've gone wrong, standing up when someone needs to be stood up to, and refusing to accept abuse of authority no matter how small the scale. Whether it's stopping a terrorist plot or ending HOA harassment, the principle remains the same. And it all started with 2 security guards demanding ID at a gate, and an FBI agent who was too tired and too annoyed to let it slide. Sometimes the smallest moments have the biggest consequences, and sometimes showing your badge is exactly the right thing to do.